The flashbulbs pop like fireworks across Hollywood Boulevard. Red carpets unfurl, velvet ropes part, and the glittering lights of 1991 promise another year of cinematic triumph. But behind the scenes, a different story unfolds. Studio executives are sweating, accountants are scrambling, and careers are hanging by a thread. What if I told you that 1991 was one of the most financially devastating years in Hollywood history, when hundreds of millions of dollars vanished into a black hole of cinematic ambition? Today, we're exposing the 13 catastrophic box office disasters that reshaped the industry, bankrupted studios, and ended careers. This was the era when big-budget spectacles were exploding in scale, when star power was reaching stratospheric costs, and when the old studio system was desperately trying to reinvent itself in a rapidly changing marketplace. The tabloid machine was hungry for failure, and audiences were becoming increasingly unpredictable. Let's dive into the 13 most catastrophic box office mistakes of 1991, beginning with a film that proved even the biggest action stars weren't bulletproof. Hudson Hawk. Hudson Hawk was supposed to be Bruce Willis's triumphant evolution from TV star to cinematic icon. With a budget of $45 million, this quirky action comedy featured Willis as a cat burglar who sings during heists, co-starring Danny Aiello and Andie MacDowell. The film had all the makings of a summer blockbuster: big star, high-concept premise, and massive studio backing from TriStar Pictures. But what happened next was a perfect storm of creative hubris and marketing confusion. Willis, co-writer of the story, delivered a film so bizarre and tonally inconsistent that audiences didn't know whether to laugh or cringe. The film's theatrical run was catastrophic, earning just $17.2 million domestically against its massive budget. The failure was so complete that it became Hollywood shorthand for star-driven excess, with director Michael Lehman nearly blacklisted from major studio work. Years later, Hudson Hawk would find a strange afterlife as a cult favorite, with midnight screenings celebrating its glorious weirdness. But in 1991, it was a stark reminder that even the biggest stars couldn't save a fundamentally flawed concept. Meanwhile, another comedy icon was about to learn the same painful lesson: The Adventures of Ford Fairlane. The Adventures of Ford Fairlane represented Andrew Dice Clay at the absolute peak of his controversial fame. The Dice Man was a cultural phenomenon in the late 80s, his shock comedy selling out arenas and making him a household name. 20th Century Fox invested $25 million in this R-rated action comedy, betting that Clay's outrageous persona would translate to cinematic gold. The film featured Clay as a rock and roll detective investigating murders in the music industry, with supporting turns from Priscilla Presley and Robert Englund. But the timing couldn't have been worse. By the film's summer release, the backlash against Clay's misogynistic comedy had reached a fever pitch, with MTV banning his videos and Saturday Night Live protesters disrupting his hosting gig. The film debuted to dismal numbers, earning just $7.2 million domestically. Fox's gamble on shock value had backfired spectacularly, effectively ending Clay's film career before it truly began. Behind the scenes, director Renny Harlin later admitted the studio had panicked and recut the film multiple times, trying to soften Clay's edge while simultaneously marketing it to his core audience. The result was a mess that pleased no one. Years later, the film would be remembered as a fascinating time capsule of comedy's culture wars, but in 1991, it was simply a disaster. Yet even as shock comedy was failing, another genre was about to demonstrate its own limitations: Nothing But Trouble. Nothing But Trouble stands as one of the most bewildering studio releases of 1991. Dan Aykroyd wrote, directed, and co-starred in this surreal comedy about a bizarre New Jersey mansion and its eccentric judge, assembling a dream cast that included Chevy Chase, Demi Moore, John Candy, and even digital music pioneer Tupac Shakur in his film debut. Warner Brothers invested $40 million in Aykroyd's passion project, expecting his Ghostbusters pedigree and star power to deliver comedy gold. But what emerged was a nightmare of tonal confusion. a film that couldn't decide if it was horror, comedy, or surreal fantasy. The grotesque makeup effects and unsettling tone left audiences bewildered rather than entertained. The film managed just $8.5 million domestically, a catastrophic failure that nearly ended Aykroyd's directorial aspirations. Behind the scenes, reports suggested Aykroyd had been given unprecedented creative freedom based on his past successes, with studio executives reluctant to challenge his increasingly bizarre vision. The film's failure became a cautionary tale about giving established stars too much unchecked power. Years later, Nothing But Trouble would develop a cult following among fans of bizarre cinema, but in 1991, it was simply too weird for mainstream audiences. Speaking of too weird for mainstream audiences, another action star was about to learn that audiences were growing tired of formulaic thrills. The Last Boy Scout. The Last Boy Scout should have been an unmitigated success. The film paired Bruce Willis, fresh from Die Hard 2, with rising comedy star Damon Wayans in a gritty action comedy script by Lethal Weapon scribe Shane Black. With a budget of $20 million and a Thanksgiving release from Warner Brothers, the film had all the ingredients for a blockbuster. But the timing was disastrous. The film arrived just weeks after Willis's Hudson Hawk had already soured audiences on his non-Die Hard persona, and its ultra-violent content proved too much for family-oriented holiday crowds. Despite positive reviews praising its sharp dialogue and chemistry between leads, the film limped to just $59.5 million worldwide, barely breaking even when marketing costs were factored in. The disappointing performance shocked the industry, as Willis and Black were both considered golden at the time. Behind the scenes, director Tony Scott reportedly clashed with producers over the film's brutal violence, with studio executives demanding cuts that might have made it more commercially viable. The film's failure demonstrated that even the perfect formula of star power and proven talent couldn't overcome poor timing and market saturation. Willis would rebound, but the experience left him more cautious about taking risks outside his established action hero persona. Meanwhile, another action icon was about to learn a similar lesson about stepping outside his comfort zone. Oscar. Oscar represented Sylvester Stallone's ambitious attempt to prove his comedic chops. The $20 million film, directed by John Landis of Trading Places fame, was a slapstick farce in which Stallone played a gangster trying to go straight, with a supporting cast including Tim Curry, Peter Riegert, and Marisa Tomei. The film was based on a French stage play and represented a deliberate departure from Stallone's action hero persona, but audiences weren't buying it. Released by Touchstone Pictures in April 1991, Oscar earned just $23.5 million domestically, barely covering its production budget and nowhere near the numbers Stallone's action films routinely generated. The failure was particularly painful as it followed Stallone's previous comedy Misfire, Stop, or My Mom Will Shoot, which would arrive the following year to even worse reception. Behind the scenes, reports suggested Stallone had struggled with the film's precise comedic timing, requiring extensive reshoots that drove up costs. The film's poor performance reinforced Hollywood's belief that audiences wanted Stallone in action mode, not comedy mode. Years later, Oscar would be reappraised by some critics as an underrated farce, but in 1991, it was simply another example of an action star failing to successfully cross genres. But while American stars were struggling with genre transitions, an acclaimed European director was about to demonstrate that international prestige couldn't guarantee domestic success. Until the End of the World. Until the End of the World stands as perhaps the most ambitious failure of 1991. German director Wim Wenders had assembled an international dream cast, including William Hurt, Solveig Daumartin, and Sam Neill, for this sprawling sci-fi road movie about a woman chasing a mysterious thief across the globe. With a budget estimated at $23 million extraordinary for an art film, Warner Brothers believed they had a crossover hit that could appeal to both art house and mainstream audiences. But what emerged was a nearly 5-hour behemoth, in its original European cut, that baffled test audiences. The studio insisted on drastic cuts, trimming it to just under 3 hours for American release. But the film remained too ponderous and experimental for mainstream tastes. The film earned just $787,000 in its limited U.S. theatrical run, a catastrophic failure by any measure. Behind the scenes, the production had been plagued by budget overruns and logistical nightmares, with Wenders shooting across 4 continents over 2 years. The film's commercial failure effectively ended Wenders' Hollywood aspirations, sending him back to European art cinema. Years later, the director's cut would be hailed by some critics as a misunderstood masterpiece, but in 1991, it was simply too much, too weird, and too expensive for American audiences. But while international auteurs were struggling, Hollywood's own youth-oriented films were proving equally unpredictable. Mobsters was Universal's attempt to capitalize on the gangster revival sparked by Goodfellas the previous year. The film featured a dream team of young heartthrobs, including Christian Slater, Patrick Dempsey, and Richard Grieco, as real-life gangsters Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Bugsy Siegel. With a budget of $20 million and a summer release, the studio expected the combination of attractive young stars and violent gangster action to resonate with younger audiences. But the timing was all wrong. The film arrived just months after The Godfather Part 3 and New Jack City had already satisfied audiences' appetite for mob stories, and its glossy, romanticized approach felt like a step backward from the gritty realism of Goodfellas. The film earned just $18.4 million domestically, another disappointment in a year already filled with them. Behind the scenes, director Michael Karbelnikoff reportedly struggled with his young cast, many of whom were making their first major film appearances. The film's failure demonstrated that even hot young stars couldn't overcome audience fatigue with a particular genre. Slater, who was being positioned as the next Tom Cruise, would see his momentum stall significantly. Years later, Mobsters would be remembered primarily for its surprisingly strong cast and its status as a fascinating misfire. But as Hollywood's young stars were struggling to find their footing, established dramatic actors were discovering that prestige didn't always equal profit. Shattered represented the kind of glossy, star-driven thriller that had been a reliable moneymaker throughout the 1980s. With a budget of $15 million, the film featured Tom Berenger as a man who discovers his life isn't what it seems after a near-fatal car accident, co-starring Greta Scacchi and Bob Hoskins. Director Wolfgang Peterson, coming off the success of In the Line of Fire, seemed like a safe bet for this psychological thriller. But the 1991 audience had grown more sophisticated, and the film's twist-heavy plot felt derivative compared to the more complex psychological dramas emerging from independent cinema. Released by Paramount in September, Shattered earned just $13.9 million domestically, failing to even recoup its production costs. The film's poor performance was particularly surprising given the strength of the thriller genre at the time, with The Silence of the Lambs still riding high from its February release. Behind the scenes, reports suggested multiple script doctors had been brought in to punch up the ending, resulting in a film that felt disjointed and tonally inconsistent. Berenger, who had been a reliable leading man throughout the 80s, would see his star power diminish significantly in the years that followed. Years later, Shattered would be remembered as a competent but forgettable thriller that arrived at exactly the wrong moment in cinematic history. But while psychological thrillers were struggling, another genre was about to demonstrate its own commercial limitations: The Five Heartbeats. The Five Heartbeats was writer-director Robert Townsend's ambitious follow-up to his groundbreaking independent success, Hollywood Shuffle. With a budget of $9.3 million, this musical drama followed the rise and fall of a 1960s soul-singing group, featuring Townsend alongside a cast that included Tico Wells and Leon. 20th Century Fox believed the film could cross over to mainstream audiences while also delivering to African-American moviegoers who had been underserved by Hollywood. But the timing was unfortunate. The film arrived just months after Spike Lee's Jungle Fever had already captured critical attention and cultural conversation about African-American cinema, and its nostalgic tone felt out of step with the more confrontational films emerging from black filmmakers. The Five Heartbeats earned just $8.5 million domestically, barely covering its production budget. Behind the scenes, Townsend had fought to maintain creative control over the project, even financing portions of it himself when the studio balked at certain sequences. The film's commercial disappointment was particularly painful, given Townsend's status as a trailblazer for independent black cinema. Years later, The Five Heartbeats would develop a passionate cult following, with its soundtrack and performances celebrated by generations of musicians and filmmakers. But in 1991, it was another example of how even the most heartfelt projects could fail to find their audience. But while musical dramas were struggling, established comedy stars were discovering that dramatic transitions were equally perilous. The Razor's Edge. The Razor's Edge stands as one of the most noble failures of 1991. Bill Murray, at the height of his comedy stardom following Ghostbusters, took a dramatic turn in this adaptation of W. Somerset Maugham's philosophical novel about a World War I veteran seeking spiritual enlightenment. With a budget of $12 million, Columbia Pictures hoped Murray's star power could elevate this literary adaptation into a crossover success. But the film's somber tone and spiritual themes proved a tough sell to audiences expecting Murray's trademark comedy. Released in September, The Razor's Edge earned just $6.5 million domestically, a catastrophic failure by any measure. Behind the scenes, Murray had spent years developing the project, even taking a hiatus from acting to study philosophy at the Sorbonne in preparation. The film's poor performance devastated Murray, who wouldn't appear in another film for 4 years. Years later, The Razor's Edge would be reappraised by some critics as an ambitious but flawed experiment, with Murray's performance gaining new appreciation. But in 1991, it was simply too serious for Murray's fans and too star-driven for art house audiences. The film's failure demonstrated the peril of genre transitions for established stars. But while dramatic comedies were struggling, another genre was about to demonstrate its own commercial vulnerabilities. Dutch represented another attempt to capitalize on TV star power in a feature film. Ed O'Neill, at the height of his Married with Children fame, starred as a working-class man tasked with driving his girlfriend's spoiled son home for Thanksgiving in this comedy from director Peter Feynman. With a budget of $17 million, 20th Century Fox believed O'Neill's TV persona would translate to big-screen success, particularly during the lucrative Thanksgiving holiday window. But the film's mean-spirited humor and predictable road trip formula failed to connect with audiences. Released in November 1991, Dutch earned just $4.6 million domestically, one of the year's most catastrophic failures relative to its budget. Behind the scenes, reports suggested O'Neill had struggled with the transition from sitcom timing to feature film performance, requiring extensive reshoots that drove up costs. The film's poor performance effectively ended O'Neill's big-screen aspirations, with the actor returning to television where he remained a beloved figure. Years later, Dutch would be remembered primarily as a footnote in the careers of its stars, particularly a young Ethan Embry who played the spoiled son. But as TV stars were struggling to make the leap to film, established movie stars were discovering that even proven formulas could fail spectacularly. Flight of the Intruder. Flight of the Intruder represented the kind of high-octane military action film that had been a reliable moneymaker throughout the 1980s. Based on the best-selling novel by Stephen Kuntz, the film featured Brad Johnson and Willem Dafoe as Navy pilots during the Vietnam War, with a budget of $30 million and direction from Top Gun producer John Milius. Paramount Pictures believed the combination of aerial combat sequences and patriotic themes would resonate with audiences in the post-Gulf War climate of 1991. But the film's timing was all wrong. Arriving in January, the film felt like a relic from a previous era, with its gung-ho military ethos seeming dated after the more nuanced war films of the late 1980s. Flight of the Intruder earned just $14.5 million domestically, less than half its production budget. Behind the scenes, the film had undergone extensive reshoots after test audiences responded poorly to its original ending, with studio executives demanding a more triumphant conclusion that still failed to satisfy viewers. The film's commercial failure was particularly painful given its connection to the successful Top Gun formula. Years later, Flight of the Intruder would be remembered primarily for its impressive aerial sequences and as a final example of the straightforward military action films that had dominated the previous decade. But while action films were struggling, the comedy genre was about to deliver its most heartbreaking disappointment. Another You. Another You marked the final screen pairing of comedy legends Richard Pryor and Gene Wilder, following their previous successes with Silver Streak and Stir Crazy. With a budget of $18 million, Universal Pictures hoped the duo's proven chemistry could overcome Pryor's declining health and the film's troubled production history. The film featured Pryor and Wilder as a con artist and an amnesiac who get entangled in a series of comedic misadventures. But the magic was gone. Pryor's multiple sclerosis was visibly affecting his performance, and the script lacked the sharp wit of their earlier collaborations. Released in August 1991, Another You earned just $10 million domestically, a disappointing end to one of comedy's most beloved partnerships. Behind the scenes, the production had been plagued by Pryor's health issues, with frequent shooting delays and the comedian's difficulty remembering lines requiring extensive script revisions. The film's failure was particularly poignant as it represented the end of an era for comedy teams. Years later, Another You would be remembered more for its sad context than its content, with Pryor's physical decline serving as a painful reminder of the comedian's real-life struggles. But as 1991's disasters continued to pile up, a pattern was emerging that would reshape Hollywood for years to come. Looking at these 13 catastrophic failures, we see Hollywood in transition during 1991. Old success formulas were becoming obsolete, as star power alone could no longer guarantee box office returns. Genre conventions shifted, with audiences rejecting glossy approaches in favor of originality and authenticity. Studio executives panicked, while tabloids amplified every failure. Yet from this chaos emerged a new Hollywood, one that would embrace riskier storytelling. The disasters sent shockwaves through executive suites, shattering the myth of the infallible star and teaching that commercial failure doesn't equal cultural value. The financial bloodletting directly led to the independent film boom of the mid-90s as studios became risk-averse. By the mid-90s, a new model emerged where quality and authenticity mattered more than star power. If you found this dive into Hollywood's most catastrophic year enlightening, subscribe and join our community of cinema truth seekers. The truth is always there, buried beneath the glittering surface.